Hello everyone, I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Today we're going to follow a touching moment in the life of Trieu Duong and his little daughter, Truc Lam. One chilly morning, as he notices the cold, damp ground beneath their home, Trieu Duong suddenly worries that the moisture and freezing earth could harm his baby girl while she sleeps. What will a father do when he realizes his child may not be safe from the cold? With nothing but bamboo, simple tools, and his determination, Trieu Duong decides to build something with his own hands to keep Truc Lam warm and protected. Will he finish it in time before night falls? Stay with us as we discover this heartfelt journey together. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming videos. The morning air was cold and damp, the kind that quietly settles into the ground and lingers long after the sun rises. Inside the small house, Trieu Duong had just finished feeding his daughter, Truc Lam. He gently patted her back until she let out a tiny burp, then wrapped her in her soft blanket and laid her down on the bedding. But as he placed his hand on the ground beside her, something immediately caught his attention. The earth floor felt icy and slightly wet. Trieu Duong frowned and pressed his palm against it again, this time holding it there for a few seconds. The chill crept into his skin almost instantly. The humidity from the night had soaked into the ground, leaving a cold dampness that refused to disappear. His eyes slowly moved from the floor to the tiny baby lying beside him. Truc Lam stretched her little arms and kicked her legs gently, unaware of the problem beneath her. A quiet worry began to grow in Trieu Duong's heart. He knew babies were sensitive to cold floors like this. Even with blankets, the damp chill from the ground could slowly rise through the bedding over time. And Truc Lam was still so small. If she slept like this every night, she might easily catch a cold. Trieu Duong sighed softly. He carefully lifted her into his arms and held her close to his chest. The baby leaned comfortably against him, her tiny head resting near his shoulder. "It's too cold down there, isn't it?" he murmured. For a moment, he simply stood there thinking. The house was simple, built with bamboo walls and wooden beams, but the floor had always been bare earth. It had never bothered him before, but now things were different. Now there was Truc Lam. Trieu Duong looked down at the damp ground once more, and suddenly an idea began to form in his mind. "If the ground is cold," he said quietly to himself, "then I just need to lift her off the ground. A bamboo floor. It would be strong, breathable, and most importantly, it would separate the bedding from the cold earth underneath." Trieu Duong nodded slowly. Yes, that would work. Without wasting any more time, he wrapped Truc Lam securely in her blanket and laid her in a small woven carrier near the doorway so she could stay warm and still see him nearby. "Stay here with Dad for a while," he whispered gently. Then he grabbed his tools and headed toward the bamboo grove not far from the house. The morning mist still lingered in the air as Trieu Duong walked through the tall bamboo stalks, studying them carefully. Not every piece of bamboo would be strong enough for a floor. He needed mature stalks, thick and sturdy. After examining a few, he finally found the right ones. This should do. He raised his machete and swung. The sound of metal striking bamboo echoed through the quiet grove. Cutting bamboo required patience and strength. Each strike sent vibrations up his arms, but Trieu Duong kept going. Swing after swing, the thick stalk slowly weakened until it finally cracked and leaned before falling to the ground with a rustling sound. One pole, then another. Soon, several long bamboo stalks lay beside him. Trieu Duong cut them into manageable sections and bundled them together. He lifted the heavy load onto his shoulder, adjusting his balance before making the slow walk back home. By the time he arrived, the sun had risen higher in the sky. Before starting the work, he stepped inside to check on Truc Lam. She had woken up. The baby lay in her carrier, waving her arms happily when she saw him. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity, as if she had been quietly watching everything. Trieu Duong couldn't help but smile. "Well, you woke up already?" He crouched beside her and gently touched her tiny hand. Truc Lam kicked her legs and made a soft, happy sound. For a few minutes, he forgot about the heavy bamboo waiting outside. He lifted her into his arms and rubbed her back gently, warming her small body with his own. "You have to stay warm, okay?" he whispered. But the bamboo floor wouldn't build itself. After placing her back in the carrier where she could safely watch, Trieu Duong carried the bamboo poles into the yard and began preparing them. The next step was the hardest part. Using a sharp knife, he carefully split each bamboo pole into long sections. The blade slid slowly along the grain until the thick bamboo cracked open. Then he split the pieces again and again. Soon the large poles turned into thin, flexible strips that could be woven together. The pile beside him grew steadily larger as the morning passed. Sweat rolled down his forehead and soaked into his shirt, but he kept working patiently. Every once in a while, he would stop and glance toward the doorway. And every time, he saw the same small face watching him. Truc Lam. Sometimes she waved her arms excitedly. Sometimes she simply stared quietly, as if fascinated by every movement her father made. Trieu Duong chuckled softly. "Just wait a little longer," he said. "Dad is making something warm for you." The afternoon sun climbed higher, and the air slowly became warmer. But Trieu Duong continued working without slowing down. Once enough bamboo strips were ready, he began weaving them together on the ground. Over, under, over, under. The bamboo strips slowly formed a tight woven pattern, strong and flexible at the same time. Little by little, the shape of a new floor began to appear. A floor that would lift Truc Lam above the cold earth. A floor that would keep her warm through the night. And as Trieu Duong continued weaving, sweat dripping from his face, he felt a quiet determination growing stronger inside him. Because every strip of bamboo he wove carried the same simple thought. This was for his daughter. The afternoon light slowly shifted across the yard as Trieu Duong continued weaving the bamboo strips together. By now, his hands had begun to ache slightly from the steady work, but he didn't slow down. Each strip had to be placed carefully so the surface would be strong and even. A weak gap in the weaving could make the floor uncomfortable or unstable, and that was the last thing he wanted for Truc Lam. Every few minutes, he paused just long enough to stretch his fingers and wipe the sweat from his forehead. Then he continued. The pattern slowly grew wider beneath his hands. Over, under, over, under. The soft cracking sound of bamboo bending and locking into place filled the quiet yard. From the doorway, Truc Lam watched everything. Sometimes she kicked her tiny legs in excitement when she saw her father moving around the bamboo pile. Other times she simply stared quietly, as if trying to understand what he was doing. Trieu Duong noticed her watching and smiled. "Are you supervising, little boss?" he joked gently. Her tiny hands waved in the air as if answering him. Seeing her like that gave him even more energy. After the woven bamboo mat reached the size he needed, Trieu Duong stood up and carefully examined it. The surface looked good, but the floor still needed a frame underneath so it could stay elevated above the ground. Without the frame, the bamboo mat would eventually sag, so the work wasn't finished yet. Trieu Duong grabbed several thicker bamboo poles and began cutting them into shorter sections. These pieces would act as the supporting beams. Using a knife, he trimmed the ends so they would sit evenly on the ground. Then he laid them out in a simple, rectangular structure. Once the base frame was ready, he lifted the woven bamboo mat and carefully placed it on top. For a moment, he adjusted the corners, making sure everything lined up properly. Then he tied the joints tightly with strong fiber rope so the pieces wouldn't shift. The small bamboo platform slowly took shape. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid. Trieu Duong pressed his palm against the surface and pushed down to test it. The bamboo flexed slightly but held firm. He nodded in satisfaction. Still, he wasn't done yet. To make sure the surface would feel comfortable, he took a knife and smoothed the edges of the bamboo strips where they had been cut. Rough edges could scratch delicate skin, and Truc Lam's skin was softer than anything, so he carefully shaved each sharp corner until the surface felt smooth to the touch. The sun had already begun sinking lower by the time he finished the final adjustments. His shirt was completely damp with sweat, and his arms felt heavy from the long hours of work. But when he looked at the finished bamboo floor standing inside the house, all the exhaustion seemed to fade away. The platform lifted the bedding several inches above the ground, allowing air to circulate underneath and keeping the damp earth far away. Warm, dry, safe. Trieu Duong stepped outside and gently picked up Truc Lam from the carrier. "Well," he said softly, "let's see if you like it." The baby blinked curiously as he carried her inside. Slowly, carefully, he laid her down on the new bamboo floor and spread the blanket beneath her. For a brief moment, Truc Lam simply stared upward. Then she stretched her arms and kicked her legs happily. Her tiny body rolled slightly as if testing the new surface beneath her. Trieu Duong watched closely, holding his breath. But instead of fussing, Truc Lam looked perfectly comfortable. She let out a soft little sound of contentment. Trieu Duong chuckled quietly. "That's a good sign." He sat beside her and placed his hand on the bamboo floor again. This time it felt completely different. No cold dampness, no chill creeping upward from the earth. The bamboo held the warmth of the afternoon air, and the small space underneath allowed moisture to stay away. It was exactly what he had hoped for. The sky outside slowly turned golden as evening approached. After cleaning up the leftover bamboo pieces, Trieu Duong returned inside and sat beside Truc Lam again. The baby had begun to grow sleepy. Her movements became slower, her eyes blinking longer each time before closing halfway. Trieu Duong gently rubbed her tiny belly through the blanket. "You must be tired after watching Dad work all day," he said softly. Truc Lam let out a small yawn. He dimmed the lantern light and sat quietly beside her. The house was peaceful now. Outside, the evening wind rustled softly through the bamboo trees. The sounds of insects began to fill the quiet air. Inside the small house, everything felt calm. Within minutes, Truc Lam drifted into a deep, peaceful sleep. Her breathing became slow and steady as she rested on the warm bamboo floor. Trieu Duong sat there watching her for a long time. The exhaustion in his arms and shoulders was still there, but it didn't matter anymore. Because the sight in front of him made everything worthwhile. His daughter was sleeping safely, warm, protected from the cold, damp earth beneath the house. Trieu Duong gently adjusted the blanket around her one last time. Then he leaned back against the wall, allowing himself a small, tired smile. Sometimes happiness didn't come from big achievements. Sometimes it came from the quiet moment at the end of a long day, when a father looked at his sleeping child and knew he had done something small to make her life just a little more comfortable. And tonight for Trieu Duong, that was more than enough. One cold and damp morning, Trieu Duong notices that the earth floor inside his small home feels wet and freezing. As he watches his baby daughter, Truc Lam, lying on the blanket, he begins to worry that the cold rising from the ground could harm her health. Determined to protect his child, he decides to build a strong bamboo floor to lift her bedding away from the damp earth. Carrying bamboo from the grove nearby, Trieu Duong spends the entire day cutting, splitting, and carefully weaving the bamboo strips together while keeping an eye on Truc Lam. Though the work is exhausting, his motivation never fades because every piece of bamboo is for his daughter's comfort. By evening, the new bamboo floor is finally finished. When Truc Lam falls asleep peacefully on the warm surface, Trieu Duong feels a deep sense of relief and happiness.